the economy of Mongolia, even today in 2018, is very unique and very special, and it's based in livestock and animals, and it is a kind of life way which is very old and which is very unique in world history. It is allows people to make a living off of in a climate which can be dry, which can be cold, and which can be harsh. And so the success of the world empires and the Genghis Khans and the Kublai Khans and the processes which linked East and West actually in many ways connect to our understanding of when, why, and how this kind of economic lifeway came about. And in order to understand that, we have to turn to archaeology. In Mongolian pastoralism, mountains play a particularly important role, and this is both in terms of the mechanics of actually herding animals, as well as in Mongolian life and Mongolian culture. And so as you can see in this beautiful picture, is everyone seeing this okay? I think we can cut more of the lights if we have trouble, but this picture, in addition to being kind of beautiful and dramatic, shows one of the key processes in pastoral life in this part of the world, which is that mountains bring rain. And most of the rain which we get here, as you may have experienced, it's quite seasonal. So in July and August, our streets of Ulaanbaatar fill completely with tons and tons of water, but through the rest of the year it can be quite dry here. And some of the places which gather rain reliably are the mountains. As these storm systems move through Central Asia, the mountains kind of milk them for the precipitation that they bring. And so they're critical to pastoralism for that and for a number of reasons. Our mountain areas in Mongolia also support a number of different kinds of herding animals and herding systems. So one thing that's very special about mountains is in the summertime, snow melt and warming temperatures mean that you get nice pastures at higher altitudes. We also have a number of animal taxa here, like the yak, which you can see this beautiful yak in Bainhongor, which are specially adapted to life in cold and high mountain regions. And so Mongolia's mountain areas support a particularly diverse range of pastoral practices, and they're particularly critical to modern life in an economic sense. Taiga zones, of which Mongolia has some very interesting areas in its northern reaches, also support unique kinds of pastoralism. So taiga refers to, there are many definitions. Some people call the whole kind of boreal forest which covers northern Eurasia taiga. In this case, what I mean is areas where the ground cover is mostly lichen rather than grass, right? And these areas in northern Mongolia actually supports the lowest latitude, the only really kind of non-Arctic area where people herd domestic reindeer as well. And so these areas are located in high altitude and high latitude parts of Mongolia, and also support, again, a kind of a different style and a more another diverse kind of pastoral practice. In contemporary and historical Mongolian culture, mountains are incredibly important, not just because they're important places for herding animals, but they have a deep religious and cultural significance. As you may know, for example, one of the holy mountains in Mongolia, Borkhan Khaldun Mountain in Henti province, where Chinggis Khan was born. But in fact, you don't have to go far to experience this. You can find it here in Ulaanbaatar with Bogtanol. And anyway, mountains occupy a special place in the heart of Mongolian culture and history as well. It is to the mountains where you connect with Ichtingr. It is to the mountains where you will find religious stone cairns, the Owo. It is where people take their treasured and valued horses the heads of horses here at Harhoren, the great former capital of the Mongolian Empire, are brought up here as a sign of respect. So these connections run quite deep here, and this is going to be kind of the reason which sparked the investigation and the work which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. So in terms of my job as an archaeologist, I spend most of my time thinking about the origins of this life of Mongolian pastoralism and the special kind of lifeways which laid the foundation for these great empires and important cultures and historical developments. And so in doing that, we go deeper and deeper into the past. And Mongolia's very earliest pastoral period is also the hardest to understand because there is very little archaeological information with which to draw upon. What we do have are a small handful, nearly all of the sites which are known from this period are shown here on this map, of burials and ritual sites which different Mongolian scholars have studied and excavated. And this is about 5,000 years ago when we have these very first people who likely practiced some kind of specialized herding-based life. And one thing that you will notice if you look about where these are located, this is an elevational map of Mongolia. So in blue you have areas at 2,000 meters or above. And you can see that actually the very first places where people lived a specialized herding life here actually very specifically concentrated on the margins of these high mountain areas, right? And that's true even through later periods where you can see that even as the population expanded and there are more and more specialized herding people, mountains still seem to be the most predictable place where we find these early sites. Now, when I'm showing you this map, what I'm showing you is not cities or gers or anything other than actually like the stone monuments like you will see kind of out in front of our National Museum, right? These are very indirect kinds of evidence about what people were doing and where people were living. And one challenge that we have is that there are actually, until 2017, almost literally no buried classical kind of archaeological habitation sites. That is a site where you could see what people were doing, how they were building their houses, what kind of food they were eating, and what those first economies were like. So as a result, understanding exactly what was going on and how this stuff emerged is particularly challenging. Now, last year in 2017, we were very lucky to discover what may be the first two habitation sites that are buried in reliable and in datable archaeological context related to this early period, so between about 3000 and about 1500 BC. Now, one thing you may notice about these is that these are not located right here in the Ulaanbaatar area or the heart of central Mongolia. Instead, we're looking at quite high mountain margin regions here. And in particular, one of the sites we located here it's called BAGSAGIIN BULAN. It is located at the margins of the Ulan-Tag special protected area in northern Huvskal. And so this is an area where today people herd domestic reindeer quite close to the location of this site. The second site is called TSAGAAN, and it's located in Altai Tavambog National Park in the high Altai Mountains of far western Mongolia. And so you can see that both of these first snapshots we have into early Mongolian life, they come from the mountains. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that might mean. But just to show a little bit about what we did last year, we did test excavations at both of these archaeological sites. And you can see it's incredibly beautiful country. And they are not deeply buried. Here is a snapshot of what the structure at BAGSAGIIN BULAN looks like. This is the structure. It was built about 4,500 years ago, and it is essentially not much more than a tent ring. What you can see along the outside are these kind of upright stones, spaced out every half meter or so, and then a central pile of stones that would have been probably a fireplace. And this site was then buried by some kind of river and wind-blown sands. And then now, as you can see, it's just rolling down the hillside. And so we caught it when there's just about a third of this structure left. And we were very fortunate to find this little snapshot into early occupation at 4,500 years ago. So here's an artist's reconstruction of what one of these things might have looked like. Really quite like a teepee in the United States, or the kind of Ortsinger that some Taten people live in today. At TSAGAAN we found a bit more, and I'm not sure how clearly this is showing, but we found a multi-room stone structure. This is probably a house and an additional kind of corral area. And these are just the stone foundations which is left. So really there's not a whole lot to see here. It's quite shallow burial. But this is radiocarbon dated now to about 1600 BC or 3,600 years ago. So still in this very early period where we really want to know what was happening in these first pastoral societies, and why are they in the mountains, and what were people doing, and what can it tell us about the origins of this really important economic system. So our excavations, as you can see, both of these are quite shallow burials, and these are kind of 3D models which we made of our excavation area. And almost the only thing which we recovered from these are tiny little bits of bone which look something like this. So this is not the most impressive insights into the early pastoral economy of Mongolia, I'm afraid. If you try, as people like myself and Jerry, a specialist in what we call archaeozoology, that is study of these ancient animal bones, we try to kind of look, identify, compare these to modern specimens and see if we can figure out what animal it was. Unfortunately, it doesn't work very well when these bones are tiny little smithereens of smashed up bones. So instead what we've been doing is a technique called zooms, and that stands for zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. And you don't really need to memorize that term. Zooms is fine. And what zooms does is it relies on differences in the actual structure of our bone. And this goes down to the actual proteins and peptides, the building blocks which make up the tissue called collagen, which is the building block of bone and other tissues. And you may know this term, I think collagen, maybe in Mongolia, because people seem to now, it's fashionable to put in your coffee. I guess it's supposed to make your cheeks look nice, or I don't recommend you doing that. But if you do, realize that you're basically just eating the same kind of little bone pieces which allow us to understand the first animal economies. The unique thing about this is very, very important to our to being alive, right? And so it changes very, very slowly in an evolutionary sense. And that means that each little change which has happened over the course of evolution of life on this planet has made a kind of a unique change that then stuck around and stayed. And so by actually studying the structure of collagen, each animal which is alive has a kind of a unique fingerprint, if you will, which looks something like this. After you zap it with a laser and get a printout, you get these kind of peaks and valleys. And the important thing to know about this is it just allows us to take these gross little bits of bone, right, and to identify actually which species we're looking at. It doesn't work perfectly. It has its challenges, but it's allowed us to kind of get a sense of what these early animal economies might have been like. And in doing so, we get a look at what animals people were eating at these first habitation sites. And in fact, they seem to suggest that people may have been, as predicted, as hoped, these may have been early pastoral economies. So most of the specimens we found at BAGSAGIIN BULAN, the oldest site, were sheep, although there's one roe deer here. That would be, the smaller version of deer, which you would see in the Mongolian countryside. And at TSAGAAN we found mostly sheep, and then either cow or yak. And with this technique, it's not possible to pick between cow or yak, but this is an area today which is yak country. And so these are giving us a suggestion into what kind of animal practices may have been used in this early period. Now, the key question that we really want to answer, and the one which I'm going to tease you with and then really kind of abandon for the rest of the day, but I'll come back to it a little bit at the end, is what do these little windows into the early economy tell us about the specialized pastoral life which we know and love and we would associate with the great Mongol Empire and other nomadic civilizations. And when we look and think about what these might mean, some different ideas come to mind. And so summarizing what we do know is that we know that in these early periods there's only a few sites, and it looks like people were using cow, sheep, and goat, but perhaps not really horse. Later on, after about 3,200 years ago or so, there are a lot more of these early pastoral sites, and they're not just in the mountain areas, and they're also using a few more species, specifically horses, in a much greater sense in terms of diet, milk, meat, this kind of thing as well. And so in terms of banding about some ideas, there are some important considerations here. One of which is that this early period was in the midst of a very nasty, centuries-long drought. After 1200 BC, when you get this diversification and these people living outside of mountain areas, it also was much wetter. So it's a possibility that this climate change had something to do with the emergence of kind of what we would now call Mongolian-style pastoralism. Another thing that we need to consider is the history of horse transport. So in this early period, at the beginning there were no domestic horses, and sometime during this early millennia, people invented horse transport, but it would have been in the form of pulling chariots rather than the kind of mounted riding which we would do today. And so the mobility of people may have something to play into this story as well. So these are kind of the big picture questions that we're trying to situate our research towards. Can we begin to answer how we got from a handful of scattered pastoral sites, mostly in mountain areas, to the thriving and diverse economic system which then persisted for much of the last hundreds and thousands of years of history. Unfortunately, we have almost no archaeological data to work with. So I've literally presented you the sum total of most of the direct evidence that we have for these early periods. And it's really quite disappointing. And it's worse when you realize that these two habitation sites which I showed you were not really in the high mountains, but instead they were along the mountain margins. And in terms of direct evidence for what was going on how did people use these regions, we have almost nothing. Moreover, we don't know, as you may see, for example, if you go to Hustai National Park or any of the great mountain areas around here, there are a lot of important things you can do in a mountain area for subsistence, which are not just herd your animals. There are rich areas for hunting and gathering and fishing and these kind of things which are important uses today. We also know nothing about the emergence of specialized mountain-adapted species in Mongolia. What we know about yak domestication or reindeer domestication, it comes essentially from other parts of the world, from areas of Tibet and from Scandinavia and the far, Arctic north. And so all of these are missing pieces of this story which may have kind of a crucial angle to add and may really be hold the answers to how we got to later developments. And so it is these research questions which we have aimed our project to answering. And specifically, we want to understand how people in the past used these alpine and taiga zones. We want to know, what role they played in pre-pastoral societies, how people used them in the first pastoral societies, and can we get some insights into the Mongolian history of animals like yak and reindeer, which are adapted to these areas. And also we want to get a sense of, we need to have a sense of what role climate change may have played in this. Whether something special about these mountain areas might tell us the questions that we want to know. And it is towards this end that I bring us to ice patch archaeology. Now, this is a kind of a funny name, and it refers to a field of research which has emerged in the last 15 or so years globally. And ice patch is a name which refers to these persistent areas of snow and ice. These are not glaciers in the sense that a glacier, you might think of a very slow-moving river of ice, which is essentially moving downhill at a glacial pace. Ice patches, or snow and ice in Mongolian, you might say munktsas or munkmus. They're essentially just eternally stable areas of snow and ice which occur in high latitude and high altitude areas. That is essentially cold areas. These typically will be on the north-facing slope, at least in the northern hemisphere of the world, right? North-facing slope that gets a little bit less sun, and they are large enough and insulated enough that while they will melt in the summer, they are essentially persist throughout the year. And where these occur depends kind of on where you are. So if you go down to Ethiopia, you will find these, but it will be maybe above 4,000 meters above sea level. Here in Mongolia, we seem to be finding them at about 2,500 or slightly thereabouts. And if you go all the way up to Norway, you might find them at 1,500 meters. So it's really just about the interplay between temperature, altitude, latitude, this kind of thing. Why are these areas important? There's a number of reasons. One of which is that they're very important ecologically to animals. So caribou, reindeer in particular, but actually other cold-adapted large animal species use these a lot in the summer. And that is especially in the case of reindeer because the biggest struggle for a reindeer in the summer is they can't regulate their own body temperature, right? And so you will see them essentially go up and play on these in terms of like rubbing their backs for temperature cooling, but also just they're crucial for body heat regulation. As a result, if you think like a hunter, these are incredibly important places for people because they're predictable areas where important prey species will hang out, right? They're important for people for a number of other reasons, one of which is that they're a constant source of incredibly fresh, clean, reliable water. And because of that water, also they can be an important source of plants which grow in areas like this. So in Alaska, and I have yet to find a blueberry patch in Mongolia here, but I'm still searching. They are a great place to make a blueberry pie. And as a result, because they're predictable locations where people can get both engage in reliable hunting of tasty animals, as well as get water, useful plant species, they've been quite an important area for people for quite a long time. They also often occur on mountain passes and areas which are important travel corridors. So here's a patch of snow, which, and many of you may have actually come across these in your travels. They often tend to occur in places where people go to and fro. And as a result of all of this stuff, they tend to be important focal points for human activity. And anywhere that there's a focal point for human activity, there will be garbage, there will be lost items, and there will be direct evidence of what people were doing in the past. And in particular, ice is a beautiful way to save artifacts, especially organic materials, which would otherwise you drop on the ground and it might take 5 years, it might take 20, but essentially it will disappear. And that will not happen if you drop something in an ice patch. And so as a result, globally, these areas have been an absolute treasure trove for archaeological discovery. And you might hazard a guess at why this field has emerged in the last 15 years. And that is because globally, these areas are melting at an incredible pace to unforeseen extents. And essentially everything which is accumulated here over the course of human history is now rapidly being sort of ejected and coming out. And so perhaps the most famous, easily the most famous of these discoveries, I'm sure everyone has heard in one way or another about Ötzi the Iceman, right? You might actually have thought he was found in a glacier or something, but in fact he was found in a snow and ice patch at the top of a mountain pass where he seems to have been shot in the back, which resulted in an arrow in the back, resulted in him falling into this ice patch and never making it out again. And as a result of this discovery, we have this enormous treasure trove of organic leather, wood, skin artifacts which Ötzi was carrying with him. And Ötzi was essentially loaded with equipment that otherwise would have been, if we found this in a burial or something where normal activities had taken place, we would have just found perhaps his skeleton and nothing more. But everything, the rich kind of material culture that he carried with him, whether it was bags, tools, etc., it was all preserved because of the ice. Now, this is a total tangent, but if you have the chance to go to the National Museum of Mongolia while you're here, a few little, it wasn't in the ice, but we have a few little snapshots like this into Mongolia's past as well. And Toshin Jargal Jerry here from the museum has actually been involved in the discovery and the research and curation of a few of these. So please do check that out if you get the chance. But some other things which often pile up in these ice patches, as I mentioned, they're great places to find animals for hunting. And as a result, one of the main things we find in here is projectiles. So that is my friend Craig in the top corner. Apparently what you're supposed to do when you do this research is take like a dramatic picture with you looking at the projectile with the mountains in the background. So I don't have one of these yet, but maybe next year. What you see on the top is actually an atlatl. So before the bow and arrow, the main method of hunting large game would have been these huge kind of javelin-style spears, which would have been thrown by an additional tool. And that whole atlatl dart was preserved in Montana, where I'm from, in an ice patch in Montana. But we also have these emerging from all over the globe, including this one from Scandinavia. In Scandinavia, almost every single ice patch here has a ton of these funky little things, which are essentially a stick which has been stuck into the patch with a little kind of a wavy noisemaker on the top. And the reason people would put these big rows of them there is they really scare reindeer. And so if you were to run a group of reindeer right at this patch of standy, wavy sticks, they're going to disperse in the other direction. And so people will use these to create drive lanes for hunting. And you just stick them in there, and they're not particularly useful to take. And so, I mean, some of these, as you can see here, have dozens of these sticks that are now melting out, which tell us about the history of reindeer hunting here. They are also, again, as we talk about travel corridors, in Norway, for example, we're getting skis even occasionally. Evidence of people going through these areas, and I don't know, I doubt they were skiing for thrills or adrenaline the way that we might today, but these kind of things are actually some of our only insights into the origins of skiing. Skiing is a very important mode of human transportation, and we don't really know where it developed. One of the places where we have early kind of rock art and petroglyphs is actually in the Mongolian Altai. And so ice patches are potentially one place where we can get direct insights into the kind of technology that people were using. This big lug here was, my job in graduate school was zipping around in this helicopter, which I can't imagine how much fuel it took to actually, lug me around in this thing and drop off at different ice patches. But we did this in Alaska, in North America. And some of the things that we discovered over the 10 or years so that this project took place were these elaborate bow and arrow projectile points, but also other things, including this birch bark basket. So as I showed you some blueberries, right? People would go up to these areas to collect berries, but also even snow. So, so there are many different things happening here, and all of it is kind of accidentally at risk for accidentally leaving some evidence behind in these ice patches. They're also an incredible source of paleoecological, climate, and environmental data. And the reason is exactly the same, that essentially whatever falls in stays until it melts out. And as a result, we have sometimes stratified records of the plants and animals which were in the proximity of these ice patches and leaving behind organic material. So one of the things that often comes out of this, is poop, animal poop that has, for example, from picking apart the dung of these ancient caribou or whichever animals are here, you actually can find out what plants they were eating, right? You can find out what the pollen of the area might have been. And you have so in a kind of a column, which you can date using radiocarbon methods, and then all of a sudden get a record of how much the ice changed over the last 1,000 years and which plants and animals were here and when. And so they're an incredible source of paleo-environmental data as well. And so one of the things people often do is take a big chunk of this, a big core, and then analyze it for this sort of analysis. Now, Mongolia is a particularly special place for frozen remnants of cultural history. Now, a good friend of mine, I don't think he is here, but Dr. Turbat at the Academy of Sciences has done a lot of these incredible, made a lot of incredible discoveries of frozen tombs in Mongolia. And these are particularly located at high altitude and high latitude, like the Altai Pazyryk tombs, which you see here. And as a result, from these frozen tombs, we have, which date to, within the last 2,500 years, we have these amazing insights into what people put in the grave with folks when they were buried at this time. And that includes, wooden handles of weapons. It includes, the kind of shoes and textiles and leather bags that people would have been carrying with them. And so there is clearly a very high potential for ice and cold to preserve the archaeological record here in Mongolia. So it is on this, sort of towards this end, that we began what I have to confess to you is a brand new project. And we have just finished our very first kind of preliminary field season, so I don't have any frozen shoes to show you here. But it's clear from looking at this that ice patch archaeology is an incredibly important potential source of data in Mongolia, and it's incredibly urgent that we conduct the same kind of research which has now been emerging in other parts of the world. And so this year we visited Baron Tag, which to situate you is the area just kind of to the northwest of that first habitation site I showed you, BAGSAGIIN, BULAN, right? In far northern part of the Darkhad basin in Mongolia. And ice patches in this area are particularly special because they are now, in 2018, incredibly important to pastoralism in the taiga. And that is especially with domestic reindeer. So here you see a photo taken by my good friend Nanselma. Reindeer, domestic reindeer, just like a wild reindeer or wild caribou, would need these areas in the summer for their heat regulation. And they will happily lie down in them, romp in them, and they will leave behind lots of organic material. So here are a couple of photos from this summer's expedition where you can see just layers of modern and ancient caribou poop and hair, which has just melted out of these ice patches and leaving, you know, these big black layers of organic material. Probably a lot of it is coming directly from their use by domestic reindeer. When these areas are not available, reindeer struggle. And in discussing with veterinarians who work in the region and with local people, reindeer will run about in search of a place to cool off. They will often end up lying down, kind of heat stressed and frustrated in an attempt to do what they can with heat regulation. And it may be that this actual stress caused by the lack of a heat of an ice patch actually directly causes health problems. They're unable to escape bugs, they're unable to thermoregulate, and so this is a big problem if these areas are not available. However, they are melting incredibly fast, and so Mongolia's Taiga region, as I told you, is the lowest latitude domestic reindeer region in the world, and as a result, this stuff is melting, and it's melting fast. So here's a photo taken of domestic reindeer in a place called Mingbulug, where we just visited in northern Mongolia in 2006. And when we visited here in 2018, this patch is gone. And according to people who live right next to it, this is the first time in memory that it has ever melted. And now it's gone. And while of course these areas won't stop kind of being on the northern side of the slope, as long as that's gone, that's an area where the reindeer can't escape heat stress. From an archaeological perspective or a paleoecological perspective, this is also horrifying, because whatever material might have been in here for hundreds or thousands of years, it only has so long by the time it melts out, right? It doesn't matter if you refreeze it if it's already worn away. So we conducted preliminary survey of ice patches in this big area of Mingbulug, and here you can see some of the students hard at work. These students actually have not come back from the field yet, so this was sent by Facebook message. So, in doing so, we do get a sense, again, I don't have any frozen shoes to show you, but we do have a sense that there are some very important insights to be gained from this kind of work. And here is a high pass called Heatstaua, which we happened to stop at on our horse trek into the taiga. And you can see that right now there's no ice. However, if you check on Google Maps, and this is not real clear, this used to be an ice patch. According to local people, it melted for the first time in 2016. We visited just now in 2018, and immediately upon arrival, don't take a snapshot of this because you'll get my passport ID card information. We discovered this piece of worked willow branch, and having a look at what we have here, it's a long, about 50 centimeter piece of worked willow, and each end has been carefully kind of split and smoothed evenly. My first thought is that this is probably some kind of a projectile point in terms of a composite piece of a larger, atlatl or something like that. But actually, the more specialists that we discussed with and the more ethnographic informants that we had, it actually seems quite likely that this is a piece of there are several options for what this may be, but the most common answer which local inhabitants suggested was that this is a traditional fishing pole. And this seems a bit silly to say there's a fishing pole in an ice patch, but this is actually located right next to some of the area's most productive fishing. And so just as we were riding out, you know, some of the local teenage hooligans came riding by with their fishing catch. What we do know is that this is probably a piece of some kind of artifact which was made using this lashing technique. So you have these willow branches with the evenly split ends, and they would have been lashed in the way shown here in the diagram. Whether it's a fishing pole or part of some kind of larger object, it's difficult to say. And we are now waiting for our scientific results to find out just how old this is. What we do know is it melted for the first time last year. And so this perhaps is giving us insights into the way people used these taiga regions in the past by preserving some of the only artifacts which we have for entire regions of these alpine and high mountain areas. So if this turns out to be a fishing pole, what does that tell us? It tells us from this we can get a scientific date of when people were up there, when the artifact was deposited. From analyzing, comparing with other archaeological materials, from discussing with ethnographic work, we can get a sense of the technology. So what kind of technology were people using in the production of their fishing poles? And then ultimately, when we compile a handful, a dozen, several dozen of these kind of little snapshots into what people were doing in these high mountain regions and when and how, we'll finally start to get our first picture into the prehistory of these regions. And we're combining this approach with other lines of archaeological evidence. So I showed you a lot of little bits of bone. That's my favorite thing to do, is play with little bits of bone. And using that kind of analysis, we're going to look at, can we understand the movements of people with animals? You know, did they move to high altitude and back seasonally? Does that leave a kind of a biochemical signature in the bones? And by combining ice patch survey and research with other available archaeological tools, hopefully we'll be able to finally answer what was the role of these taiga and alpine zones in the emergence of pastoral societies in Mongolia. So here a couple of the kind of our attempts to stabilize and curate the artifacts that we found. So actually we have a couple other bits of antler and bone and ecological material, potentially worked pieces of wood that were put on our horse and brought it back to the museum, and now we're in the process of kind of curating and analyzing these things and trying to understand what they may mean for our understanding of the past.
Can you explain again how you think that stick was a fishing pole?
Well, I actually, as you might have guessed, I don't think it's a fishing pole. But what it is, definitely, is a worked piece of wood that would have probably been lashed together. And some of the things that people would make out of these include large nets, perhaps some frames for carrying things. There are a lot of things that could be made using this technique. The one which local Tsaten people knew through their grandma, and nobody makes this anymore, but they know the technique, and they used to use it for making fishing poles. So first we're going to have to see how old it is, and then we're going to have to go from there through comparison with other archaeological materials. This is a sketch that one of the local folks made about how such a fishing pole would be produced. And the reason that you would do that in multiple pieces, right, is you get this curvature, and it's strong, and it's a beautiful technique for making wood stuff because it gives you this kind of resilience. That's as much as I'd be comfortable saying, but maybe it is a fishing pole.
The local people said, "Oh yeah, that's a fishing."
Three separate groups of people said that's probably a fishing pole. So yeah. So in any case, I think we can wrap up by saying that what we know from looking at Mongolia today and what we know from looking at Mongolia in the past is that these mountain regions are crucial because they support not just, they don't just serve as kind of rain gathering areas where you have reliable grassland and you have these, summer pastures, but actually support a diverse range of different domestic animal taxa, and people use them for a variety of purposes, hunting, gathering, etc. And they've clearly been the nexus of early pastoral life in Mongolia. And so if we want to understand how we got to these incredible nomadic societies later in prehistory and history, we really have to be looking in these high mountain regions. Unfortunately, there's not much to go on in terms of direct archaeological data. Mountain regions, people have been using seasonally. They've been exposed. They are geologically active areas where you drop something on the ground and it's rolling downhill. It's being crushed by rocks. There's snow. There's ice. It is an incredibly bad place for archaeological data to stick around. And one of the few areas that we have where that data is going to pile up are ice patches. And our preliminary work suggests that doing more systematic, detailed ice patch survey is not just likely to produce some important insights, as these few artifacts that are popping out show us, but also that this is an incredibly urgent time to do so, because some of these patches are literally this week melting out for the first time, and once that material is gone, it may be gone forever. And so if we really want to answer these questions, this kind of work has to happen right now. And in doing so, I think we may actually have the first insights into not just what people did in these patches and how people used mountain regions, but some of the big questions that we know nothing about, like the history of yak and reindeer domestication in Mongolia. These are really important, really crucial species, and our only data sources for them may be sort of melting away. And so it is in this, towards this end, that Dr. Clark and I have started this project. We have just gotten our feet wet, as it were, and hope to continue this work, not just in the Taiga, but in the high mountain areas of the Hangai and the Altai mountains going forward. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention.